You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to Raincoast Radio's first series of Wolves and Women. I'm Chelsea Greer, Director of Raincoast's Wolf Conservation Program, and your host for this series of conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. Today, I am excited to be joined by conservation biologist and genetics researcher, Astrid Vik Stronen.
Welcome, Astrid.
Thanks for having me. I'm Astrid Vik Stronen. I'm a biologist that works mostly on wolves and also a number of other carnivores. Right now, I live in Slovenia, where I've been for about 6 years, but I've earlier worked in other countries, including Canada, Poland, Denmark, and been very grateful to be able to study wildlife and meet with and work with a lot of biologists and local people and interest groups throughout these areas. So right now I work at the University of Ljubljana and do mostly genetics and genomics works on carnivores.
Great. Well, I'd love to kind of dive into some of maybe your earlier experiences or your background and how that kind of influenced where you've gotten to today and led you to want to study wildlife.
Yes, I grew up on a farm, so I've always worked with animals and always really liked being around animals and studying them, and got to be increasingly interested in dogs and in wildlife. And that's how I've sort of ended up the path where I am now. So I've also done some work with endangered domestic species and sort of been a bit back and forth, but mostly worked on wildlife. And generally, I started in ecology and then sort of migrated over to genetics. So in that sense, it's been good to be in various fields. And I'm also very thankful for the farming background and having spent so much time outdoors and in nature. As a young person, I realize not everyone is so fortunate today. So that is something to look back on, that you maybe think as a child, this is what everyone does, but it isn't. So it's very good to have had much time in nature. And this is really how I got into wildlife studies.
Yeah, it makes me think about how just being in nature and being a child, like when you're so curious, having that chance to be in nature and be so inspired by what's around you. And yeah, unfortunately, not everyone has that opportunity now even with technology getting in the way of us appreciating nature. But that's great to hear. So you were born in Norway. You've worked in multiple different countries. Now you're working in Slovenia. What initially led you to Canada?
I was always interested in Canada because it has so much wildlife and these large spaces and different cultures. And I got in contact with a couple of biologists from North America, and especially Paul Paquette, who I worked with starting from my master's on caribou. I got connected via various people. One of them is also a person in Norway that I worked with a little bit, Petter Vabakken, who knows Paul Paquette, and got in contact a little bit that way by doing a course with Petter and learning from him in Eastern Norway. So yeah, this way it led me to apply for a master's degree at University of Calgary, and I worked there with Paul Paquette and Stephen Herrero and worked on the Telkwa caribou herd in British Columbia. That's how it got started in Canada.
And so was that more of a focus, because you talked about how initially your career was focused on ecology. So what kind of things did you focus on for your master's?
This was the work of looking at a caribou herd where they had been doing relocation of animals, because in the late 1990s, they counted only 11 animals left, which is a very small group. So they relocated animals from a nearby Tweedsmuir caribou herd into the Telkwa mountain range. And then I was engaged as a master's student to follow a number of the collared caribou and look at their habitat use, their calving area. I also had the opportunity to work with local native people, with Sutan people, and learning some of their traditional knowledge about areas that had been important for this caribou herd over time. So this was an ecology study. There was not genetics in that master study, but a lot of the ecology, the movement of animals, where they move, where they don't move, what may be the reasons for them using certain habitats, and then all the questions around conservation of a small population and threats to small populations.
Was there anything out of that project that, like any findings that came out that were really surprising or interesting?
We were quite interested in seeing some of the calving areas they used, and there was also some animals that would come down into the valley and some that would not. So, of course, when you have a small group of animals, is that just individual variation, or what is leading to this is not always easy to say. We had only one original caribou collared, so unfortunately we didn't have a lot of comparison, but we were able to follow that animal and a couple of other females. Some did make some fairly, not very long, but some like long distance movements over only a few days. So some of these movements and why they did them were always interesting to us. But yeah, it was areas were also at times used quite a lot with people who were doing outdoors activities, especially snowmobiling. So it's also important to raise awareness of how that can affect animals, especially in the winter when they're short of energy. So some of those areas that we found where everyone likes to be, maybe the caribou is losing out a bit. So that was something that came out of that project.
Yeah, an important compromise of recreational activities versus conservation of species. Yeah, and so from that, what led you to pursue the field of conservation genetics?
I got started working in these projects and really could see that the small population were a big issue for many of these populations that had conservation issues. You had few animals left. And maybe then, for example, in the caribou project, we collared a couple of small calves, and by chance, there were 6 males and 1 female. So all these things, really shows the importance of population numbers and just random factors. So I felt that it was really interesting to work on some of these genetic aspects too and learn more, which I had the chance to do when I started the PhD work in Riding Mountain. So there, the genetics is also a way to follow animals without necessarily interacting with them or interfering with them. So in that sense too, a lot of the tools now and non-genetic methods that we have are really promising for doing a lot of conservation work, but in a sort of a little bit distant to the animals so that you don't actually need to disturb them. So that was sort of how that got started as well.
Yeah, so could you maybe break down more in like layman's terms a little bit about the genetics work and what information we can get from like what exactly you're collecting?
Yes, we have been very interested in looking at genetic profiles of animals. And of course, depending on what material you collect, and some of that's invasive, some is non-invasive, you can get varying amounts of information. But really with modern techniques that we are using, we can get individual profiles using perhaps only 10, 20 markers that typically we use these microsatellite markers, which is sort of short tandem repeats of a few genetic letters in the code, maybe 3, 4, 5 letters. And then because they are so variable, if you have 10 or so markers, you can get individual profiles and you can tell siblings apart, for example, in a wolf pack. So by collecting, say, hair or scats or other material, it can be bird feathers or snake skins or various sorts of material, we can get these individual profiles. And if we have that, we can look at relatedness among animals and we can look at population structures. Some of the really key work that we do in conservation genetics is looking at, for example, inbreeding levels. Are they increasing? That would not be a good sign. Are there population structures, and what may explain such population structures? Is it that they, for example, are isolated because of a lot of human development, infrastructure, big highways, etc.? Or are there also isolation because of ecological factors? Some of we are seeing structures like in the British Columbia coast between island and inland wolves because of more ecological factors. But sometimes we're seeing that animals get isolated because of human development, say, and you have small populations that are increasingly experiencing loss of genetic variation, and then they will be less able to evolve when new environmental challenges come, like climate change. And we are able then to monitor this over time and look at trends, for example, in how much genetic variation is there Is there some, what we can call private genetic variation in some population? Is it linked to any particular adaptation, for example? A nice example here is some of the work they've done in the mountains in Tibet, where they found some information via the genetic studies that suggests adaptation to higher elevation because you live at areas with low oxygen, with hypoxia. So this is seen in various species, but a very interesting adaptation that they've been able to look at via genetic analysis. So the differences in genetic can have various factors, and that's some of these puzzles that we are trying to figure out and then monitor over time.
Yeah, and so you said that you really started exploring this field of genetics when you started working in Riding Mountain National Park. So for our audience, Riding Mountain National Park is in southwestern Manitoba, Canada. Can you describe the landscape there?
Yes, the landscape there is maybe not what people in the Alps will call a mountain. It's then very sort of rolling hills, but not flat as most of the rest of the prairies is. And when you are on the east side, you have this escarpment, which is slightly more steep with some bigger ravines and more, not dramatic terrain, but more lively terrain than in the west, where you have generally more very gentle hill and some broad valleys. And it's a forested area generally, some open grasslands also, but quite forested, mixed forest, whereas the prairie around is generally now not having much forest. So it really is a landscape that stands out on a satellite image in offering a rich and very diverse forest in this southern part of the prairies. And then a few little distance to the north, there is the Duck Mountain Provincial Park and Forest, which is a similar, not quite so isolated, but also like a island of forest in a way in prairie landscape.
Yeah, I've only heard, from you and from Paul, how amazing that region is. So when you started working in Riding Mountain National Park, what was the initial goals and objectives of the work that you were doing?
The main goal then was trying to get a better understanding via genetics, but also coloring some animals on whether this wolf population was really isolated and how isolated they were, if we could collect genetic data in that area, in the neighboring parks and regions, and try to understand via genetic the extent of isolation and genetic variation in this park versus other areas, and also by coloring some animals, how they relate to the outside. Do they go outside, and what their behavior were in terms of also whether packs would sometimes overlap, what kind of territory size they would have, learning a bit about the situation then for the park. This had been studied earlier 70s, 80s by Lou Carbon and Paul Paquette, and they're just building on this and adding in more genetics and more also disease and parasite analysis to try to get an understanding of, to some extent, a little bit what impact there are from being on a sort of this forested island, because you have such a high, what we can call reservoir of other dogs and coyotes around, much bigger populations. So we were curious also and collected some data on trying to see if there were issues with the canine parvovirus, canine distemper virus. We know there had been some canine distemper virus earlier. We did find some, at least one mortality due to that, and that also was found later in work after I finished. So some of these issues to try and see what the situation was for the park wolves. That was the goal, sort of a broader ecological study.
Yeah, and why is it important to study disease and parasites in wolves and in wildlife in general?
Yeah, some reason is that for now with the climate change, some of these parasites and diseases are actually moving. Some areas are getting warmer, some ecological conditions are changing. So this is an interesting topic in itself. For example, movement of, say, Lyme disease is moving north into what has been colder areas. Some colleagues in Canada have been working on this. And we see also in Norway, for example, that you have some of these ticks, etc., moving further north than they have been before. So these are issues that are important broader, also because they relate to humans and things that we can get as well when we collect it from wildlife, whether we want to or not. That happens. And we have also these issues of trying to understand what happens to small populations. And they, of course, if they are hit by any infectious disease that maybe they can get from another canid, then you can have a high rate of mortality. This has happened on the small Isle Royale population earlier, when I think a dog maybe brought in a disease and many wolves died. And this is something that also was a concern in Rocky Mountain because of the small population. If there are anyone who might, visit, and then they have a dog, and then the dog leaves a scat, and these can be contagious for some time in the environment, and there can be impacts on wolves. And that makes it important also to monitor, I think, over time. And then, of course, for an animal with poor condition would also have more impacts from parasites than a healthier one. So looking at this.
And in this area, I mean, you've spent a lot of time now in the lab, but in Riding Mountain National Park, that's where you did a lot of your field work. And it was there that you got to work with your good friend, Gudrun Fluger, who this series is dedicated to. Can you tell us a little bit about her? Because her background was so interesting as well before she got into the wolf work.
Yes, Gudrun was an expert skier, so absolutely someone that you didn't even think to keep up with, but that's perfectly fine. She would cover so much terrain on her own. Yes, no, I'm very grateful to have worked with Gudrun, and we spent many long days, some cold days, a lot of fun days in the field, and did a lot of tracking of wolves and finding ungulate kills and trying to piece together the paths and behaviors of wolves in the park. And I was actually really thinking of her today as I was coming back I was on a work trip to Italy, and I was in a very nice cafe in Trieste this afternoon, Cafe San Marco in Trieste, and we were both very much happy to have good coffee. I think we were very European in that sense, so we had so much fun often trying to look out for places with good coffee and discuss how coffee doesn't have to be very big, but it should be very strong, which is sometimes the opposite in North America. They should be very big, but not very strong. So it's this, so we had a lot of times in the field that we had. Yeah, she always amazed me with her good sense of humor, whatever the conditions. She would have a great sense of humor, and she also had a lot of experience from working in many areas on the coast, in Prince Albert, in Saskatchewan, and then in Riding Mountain. So that was a very nice background to have. And of course, she had done so much outdoor work, all the marathon running and skiing and all this really strong outdoor experience that she had. So she always used to say when we went out anywhere that we usually ate lunch fairly early. She said, no, everything you've already eaten, you don't have to carry. So it was one of the classic Gudrun comments. So yes, we had very many nice field trips.
Yeah, and those skills as like a mountain runner and a cross-country skier. I mean, the stories that I've heard from Paul, you think about how much time it takes to cover a landscape looking for scat. And when you have a skill like that and you can he's like, yeah, she would just go off skiing and like cover so much ground in so little time. And we'll include some links to these films in the show notes, but there's a couple films that have been made featuring Gudrun and just really capturing her like running through these landscapes and, sensing like when wolves are there, there's some kind of like, you just feel it. Yeah, I would definitely recommend to our listeners to watch these films because there's some amazing stories that have come out of it as well and some really inspirational stuff. The two of you also work together on a study, not necessarily in the field together, but I want to talk a little bit about this seminal study from the Central Coast of BC that you were part of that looked at the population genetic structure of gray wolves. So Gudrun was involved a lot in the fieldwork aspect of it. Can you tell me a little bit about what your role in the study was?
Yeah, I was not working on the field, so I was involved a bit later there on taking part in analyzing some of the genetic data. So Erin Navid had been doing analysis in this for her master's, and then we went back and redid some analysis and added some more mapping of the results, etc., to have a better look at the spatial genetic profiles that we found. So it was basically analysis of some samples that were difficult because the conditions there means that it's not easy to preserve these scat samples. It's very humid, it's very challenging to get good data, and Erin and I often discuss this because we found that actually different seasons work better on the prairie, which is a giant freezer in the winter practically, so everything freezes and you get really good results because it's very stable conditions. On the coast, this was hard, so we had a difficult data set to work with, but we could still see that we did find some coastal interior structures. And what's nice to see too is that later work with a lot of genomic profiles, like the nice study that Rena Schweitzer and colleagues published in 2016 did a lot of genomic works, and they're finding these coastal unique genotypes too. So it's definitely nice to see this across time and space. We had a small data set, but still were very interested in these findings that we could see, and that they also matched with what we learned from Native people's knowledge of the area. And you also had the dietary analysis, and you had parasite analysis, where the parasites in this case would show this Diphyllobotrium parasite is really linked to eating salmon. And you could see this showing up in areas where the wolves are eating a lot of salmon. So Heather Bryan work showing this very nicely, that we have sort of multiple independent lines of evidence that suggest there really is this very marine lifestyle in the coastal area.
Yeah. So what was the main finding, just for listeners that maybe aren't familiar with this work?
Yeah, there is clearly some structuring between coastal areas and genetic structuring between coastal and more mainland areas, and then supported again with having different dietary profiles, more marine mammals, more salmon, and then these parasites linked to salmon, and then showing a different kind of lifestyle of wolves on the coast, really living more off of marine resources and probably being a lot more used to swimming, I think, also based on what I've learned and read from colleagues there. So this is a really very interesting finding to see, because we have a very classic picture of wolf often that they are chasing an elk or a moose or something, but they can really take advantage of a huge array of resources. And here we really see this nice specialization on marine resources and the marine lifestyle. So this has been very interesting to see, and pushes us humans a bit to broaden our minds on how wolves live too, and the diversity of lives that they can have.
Yeah. And what are some of the conservation implications of this research when we think about how different these coastal species are from their mainland counterparts?
Yeah, I think it's important that we see how much they rely on the marine resources and also fish. So on making plans for conserving species, we need to think of their entire environment. So then making sure that we are counting for those resources, and also that they are often maybe moving between islands on the coast, and they have a different use of space than maybe what we think of only from wolves on land. So I think considering this is important, and then thinking of preserving this kind of wolf culture as well, that we take that into account. It makes an important addition to the biodiversity that we have on the Pacific coast.
And just for my own curiosity, when you're talking about the sample size, because I remember reading that it's like over 1,000 samples. So I'm curious, was it around 1,000 samples, but were you not able to use all of them because of the conditions that they were collected in?
Do you mean the scat samples that they collected?
The scat samples, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how many they collected altogether, probably a lot of them over years, but I'm also quite sure that quite a few will not have worked because of maybe they have been washed out too much by rain, or there's too much mold, or as far as I know, times of the year it's very difficult to access there. So then that means maybe you have a hard time finding new fresh material when you do go, and the lush environment probably also means it's much more challenging. We discussed this, Erin and I can follow a wolf track in the snow and fairly easily find a brown scat against the white snow, whereas Erin had to go searching, and the colleagues on the coast had to really search, and there's all this lush vegetation, and so finding enough material but also finding enough fresh material is probably often quite hard. And then these environmental conditions there probably makes that some samples don't work enough. Maybe you'll get a few markers and you can see that it's wolf, but not enough for getting a genetic profile. So then you can't really analyze it very well. That sometimes happens also to us. Something we have now in Slovenia, that we would monitor samples, maybe from livestock kills, then there would be a bit of saliva. And sometimes my colleagues can lift off enough material to say, this was a wolf or a dog or a jackal, but not enough to get a genetic profile. So,
yeah, because that's interesting. Because the work, some of the research that I've been part of, not on the Central Coast, but more South Coast region, we've been collecting opportunistically, essentially, as much scat as we can. And with dietary analysis, these older scats, we can still get a lot of information. But yeah, with the individual profiles, a lot of these scats, it's so exciting when you find them. But now I'm realizing as time went on, I'm like, oh, like that looks very different from what we've been collecting, because I haven't seen, it's like the first fresh scat I've seen. Most of it is like this ball of hair that's shaped like a scat. And I'm like, oh, this is so exciting. This is obviously wolf. Like we can see the elk and the bones in here. But then, yeah, you see a really fresh scat and you're like, oh, that's the gold right there.
yes. And sometimes you don't have a lot of choice, You find a few after kilometers and kilometers of hiking, but maybe those are not very fresh. So yes, that can be challenging.
Yeah, but I never thought I would be so ecstatic to come across wolf scat. Even when I'm walking my dog, I'm like, oh, like, is that coyote scat? Oh, like what has that dog been eating?
Yes.
So I guess I'd love to talk to you a little bit about like wolf ecotypes and just ecotype designation more broadly. So I guess to start, could you briefly explain what ecotypes are and how they differ from subspecies in the context of wildlife conservation?
Yeah, ecotype really focus on the ecological variation and variation that's linked to some kind of environmental differences. So heritable differences, which could be morphology, behavior, physiology, some things we see, some things we don't see, but linked to environmental variation or ecological variation. So really connected to some aspect of the environment, and then being a heritable difference. We also have something which is sort of more temporary, what we often call phenotypic plasticity. So, if you, like on the farm, when we would have cows out in the colder time of the year, they grow longer fur, and then when it gets warm again, the fur is shorter. So this is the same genetic profile, but it's just a variation of the phenotype you can produce from that genetic profile. But ecotypes would be more linked to that there were animals that had a distinct genetic profile linked to some aspect in the environment, and that's heritable. Now, we have not always, we did a review of this work, in that sometimes it hasn't been linked to genetics. Basically, it has been linked to using different habitats or different morphology, etc. But I think a lot of that is because we haven't had good genetic tools for a lot of species. Now, we are lucky with those species that are closely related to domestic animals. So wolves are lucky in being closely related to the dog. I worked a little bit on wild boar with colleagues, and they're closely related to domestic pigs. So you already have a lot of incentives for people to make good genomic tools available for those species. And with more and more genomic tools available, we can really dig into this more. So I think it's a exciting area. But in short, we're learning more about this too. So defining ecotype, it's not always black and white, but we are seeing these differences that linked often to this adaptive variation that would be suggesting that animals are adapted to a local environmental condition. And then subspecies can also be a bit tricky to define, but it is more a different, evolving lineage. But here, this could be ecological differences, but maybe also isolation. One example of the ecotype is this in British Columbia, that you see the coastal and the more interior wolves. In Europe and also North America, you have maybe subspecies. Here we could, for example, use the Italian wolf, which is often considered as a subspecies in Italy, being very isolated. These wolves are still very distinct when we start looking with genomic markers, which we're doing now, working with Italian colleagues. And this is a trip I just came home from that led me to sit in the Italian cafe this afternoon. And here we are looking at these wolves, but it's not obvious that they are adapted differently. Maybe this is just a very long isolation process, with glaciation processes and Italian Alps kind of being a barrier. So wolves being stuck in a small population in Central Italy for a long time. So the subspecies is not necessarily so much about ecology. It could be, but maybe it is also simply geographical isolation or other factors. And the ecotype is interesting too, in that maybe that's something that one day will become subspecies or species. So these, take a time to develop, and maybe it started as an ecotype somewhere. So this is something I think we're learning a lot about now, and we're learning more and more as we get better genomic tools and that we're able to look at more functional genetic variation.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And it really showcases, I imagine since you started working in conservation genetics, like now what you're talking about with ecotypes, like just showing the evolution of advancements in the field and all this information that we can get. And so in BC, what are the specific ecotypes that are present?
Yeah, I think this is maybe still something that's being studied out now that we have more genomic information. Definitely, we are seeing this coastal ecotype, and there is interior. And then I don't know if there are more specific that are clearly easy to define in BC, but there seems to be for sure, animals in the Arctic, further north and east in Canada. So there are different ecotypes in that sense. So yeah, there's probably still work to be done on how many there are in North America and in British Columbia, and also how particular you are in defining them. That's interesting also when you deal with species like this that can move such long distances. So that becomes interesting then, and it would be maybe different if you were studying mice or studying wolves or something that can be just in a very small space, because we also have the factors of wolves having been sometimes reduced to very small populations and isolated populations. So we have also a lot of what we call genetic drift to account for sometimes, that it's just random changes often, and even stronger so in small populations. So yeah, I think we're still learning about this and how strictly to define it also.
Yeah, that's always an interesting topic about, these kind of human constructs that we create in defining something and what that means for our understanding of the animals. That was a good point too about wolves specifically, where often these populations are decreased to lower numbers or extirpated for some regions. The wolves that we're studying on the South Coast, one big question is like, who are these wolves? Where did they come from? Did they come from this coastal rainforest ecotype, or did they come from the interior, or is it an admixture of both? And that presents a lot of questions about, how they've adapted to their environment as well.
Yes. Yeah, there are a lot of things to untangle, and it's not always easy, but that makes science also very interesting to be working on.
Yeah. And so given that ecotypes are often adapted to a specific environment, in the face of climate change, how might those kind of challenges impact the survival of these specialized groups, and particular species like wolves and other wildlife?
Yeah, I guess that can depend on what kind of changes that are happening in their environment. We have discussed it a little bit here in the region that I work now in Southeastern Europe, because some areas are very dry, like this karst landscape, has very little water. And then if you get even warmer and even drier, will there be, not necessarily for wolves who move long distances, but for species in general, if you're struggling with this already, and then you have even hotter and drier environment, what will the consequences be of that? And then I've also discussed a lot with my students, maybe the really important genotypes for many species are here in Southern Europe, because they're already adapted to hot and dry weather, and that's going to increase. So that might be important genetic variation that we still don't fully understand, but that may be really important, both because there is high genetic diversity, so there is much variation for evolution to work on, but also because it is warm and dry already. So these are interesting questions, I think, for further research across species.
And when you think about the importance of this research, and in terms of, I guess, environmental protection and wildlife conservation, what kind of policy changes do you think are needed to better incorporate the ecotype concept into these protection strategies?
Yeah, I think that combined with new tools that we can really start to understand more, adapt to genetic variation, that can allow us to designate important groups or even genetic variants without a lot of discussion on is this or is this not a species. Sometimes things get stuck there a lot, but if you have these ecological types, they might be within a species. Maybe that's very important variation to preserve in itself. So I think looking at these very functional aspect is important, and then maintaining also genetic diversity and monitoring it. This is now work that have been increasingly raised also for the conservation biological diversity and these international conventions to try to incorporate genetic variation also for wild species into these measures and to monitor it as well, to use modern tools actually to learn what variation we have and then try to preserve that.
And thinking about, I guess, ecotypes, it also makes me think about the concept or the occurrence of hybridization. And I know you've done some work on this, so I was wondering if you could first, I guess, explain what canid hybridization is and how it happens.
Yeah, this hybridization in canids can include various species. So here in Europe, we deal a lot with wolf-dog hybridization. And in North America, there's hybridization between wolves and jackals. So the main concern that we have is that anything that's sort of human-induced is a concern. There are, for example, from other species, examples of hybridization that happens naturally and that is simply would happen even if humans were there or not. So one example I discuss a lot with students is some species of sheep that were separated, or they maybe became two species of sheep because of glaciation and separation. And then when glaciers, ice sheets retreat, this sheep come together again, and now they breed. Even if they are two species, they can breed together. And this, of course, would happen whether or not humans were here. So then we're not worried about this kind of hybridization. But when it's linked to these human actions, and of course, anything dealing with dogs here in Europe is linked to humans because dogs are here because of us, then it is a concern for conservation and maintaining the ecological and evolutionary role of wolves, and also maintaining the predator-prey relationships that they've had. For North America, we've had these examples of wolf-coyote hybridization in the east, and here it may be important to also look at local ecological contexts, because in some areas there are now what many would call eastern coyotes, but they are maybe now in some areas of the east taking over the sort of niche left empty when we lost wolves and filling that role as a predator of, for example, deer. And then they are probably important in the local ecosystem. They are now the large predator in that ecosystem. So in that sense, they may be filling that ecological niche now that we don't have wolves there. In other areas, there are still wolves. And here, I think, for example, if we look at preserving the ecological role of wolves, that means we also would preserve large predators and the relationship they have. So if we maintain large species like moose, then we are also helping to preserve the predator that can take those species. So I think it's a bit of a puzzle that occurs across a large area of North America and in Europe, and it can involve various species. So we're still really learning a lot about this. But when it is induced by humans and it's humans, playing an important role, then I think it is a concern for the long-term ecological and evolutionary integrity of wolves and the not just the wolves isolated, but the role the wolf is playing as a large ungulate predator.
Yeah, and I wonder, it seems like there's a lot of unknowns around conservation strategies because they're often created for wolves or coyotes or a specific species. So I wonder what the implications of hybridization are for wildlife conservation when, maybe they're filling this specific role, but then we see them as I think of red wolves and they have such a small population, but maybe they fill a similar role to the coyotes that are living amongst them, but we treat them so differently because one is an endangered species and one isn't.
Yeah, it's quite important to think of the population status maybe sometimes, because some populations are very small, like the red wolf that you mentioned, and then they can be more easily swamped by hybridization and hybrids, whereas maybe that would be a lesser threat in a large population. But this implication can maybe be that we are seeing a change over time in animal ecology, behavior, size, morphology. A coyote would have a smaller skull, a more finely shaped jaw, and would not be a moose predator. If we put it this way, maybe they can take some calves, but yeah, it's a different kind of animal in that sense. Preserving the large ungulate predators that wolves have been, to me, I think the key is really to look at the ecology in many ways, and then trying to preserve that long-term role. And there will now be populations that does have maybe some sense of introgression, but as several others have pointed out too in recent papers, if you try to preserve that ecological function, you probably also help preserve the wolf components, if you can call it that, of the animal. You preserve the wolfness or wolf-like morphology and behavior and ecology of those animals. So that's also a useful way to think of conservation, I think, to preserve that role, preserve that ecological behavior.
Yeah, because when I think about wolves, that ecological role is so profound and so important for those ecosystems as well. Yeah, so a lot of your work, with the genetics, it involves these often non-invasive techniques, but you've also been working or been involved in some other advancements in technology when it comes to non-invasive methods, like the bioacoustic detection of wolves. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that work? We've got some acoustic recorders in some of the watersheds that we're working in now. We've got terabytes of data, but haven't gone through it all yet.
Oh, yeah. Yes, this was work that I basically helped out in. So I was not a major person there, but I was very interested to help out. And Hanne Lingholm-Larsen and colleagues in Denmark really did a study to try to use this bioacoustics for monitoring. And Denmark is a country that doesn't get much snow, so snow tracking is kind of out, or very rarely is there any snow. And then it's windy, so it's also difficult if you have snow. If you've been tracking wolves and you go out into anywhere open, then the tracks disappear, so you lose the path, even if you do have snow or mud. But they are quite interested in trying to see, can you do this kind of surveying when you don't have that ability to go on the ground so easily, which also makes it very hard to find scat. If you can at least find some wolf trails and you are patient enough, you will eventually find some scats. But in Denmark, that's not so easy either. It's not easy to go tracking. So they were curious whether you can use this tool and monitor by using acoustics. And they could find that, yeah, you can tell quite a lot about individuals. And they did some tests too on different wolves, using some captive wolves to try and see if there were different profiles in different wolf groups. And it seemed that you can get quite a lot of information. So it's a promising tool as well. I think it's also a nice way to use creatively a non-invasive tool for areas that don't work well for tracking, snow tracking or mud tracking or any tracking.
Yeah, and it seems like a great complementary tool to other things as well, like with camera traps. You don't have, camera traps, you only have that certain field of view, but then complemented with an acoustic recorder that I know in Yellowstone, they had some acoustic recorders that were detecting wolves from 6 kilometers away, which is obviously a very, very different than, when you're in mountainous terrain and have to think about the wind, the sound of moving water, the temperature, and all of these things. But yeah, it seems like a very good complementary tool to a lot of these other things.
Yeah, I think it's very nice. And I don't know how likely all animals are to answer, but if you can also capture pups and maybe see how many there are, and maybe you can capture if there are any jackals as well, which they also now have in Denmark, and you can learn different things. So I don't know if they've had answer from jackals. I'd have to ask them next time I'm in Denmark, but potentially you can capture quite a few different things. And that's interesting, I think, also. So you have a wider range this way.
Yeah, like the soundscape of the whole environment. I think about studying wolves isn't just studying wolves, it's studying their prey species, what other animals are living amongst them. I mean, we've, as bycatch, have captured so many different bird species as well.
No, and this was also something we started learning here with the wolf monitoring, that we're finding a lot of jackals. So some of the scats we would get are kind of, wrong, but they're actually very useful because we're finding jackals, and we started finding out which markers work for jackals and then finding a way to also monitor them better. And some of the sort of accidental data we got were therefore very, very useful. So this has been a nice resource as well. And we can use, these markers that I mentioned, they're so variable that you can tell that it's a jackal. So we've got a lot of profiles this way as well. So yes, we also had bycatch, that's a good word, that gave us very useful data.
Great. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on?
Yes, so we are working on a couple of different projects, mostly our work on wolf projects. And there is research on wolves, the issue with hybridization with dogs that I mentioned. So we're looking into this and looking into making better tools for discriminating wolves hybrids and, the first generation hybrids and back crosses. When a hybrid crosses back into the wolf population, you can also track this with non-invasive data, at least for the first few generations, if they're crossing back into wolves again. So we're trying to make tools for tracking this, also non-invasively, and efforts to standardize this a bit across Europe so that we all agree on what do we mean with a hybrid or a backcross, and that we can use similar methods and therefore be able to monitor it in different parts of the continent and understand these processes a bit better and what's driving them. And we're also part of this one is called a biodiversa project called Wolfness. And then we're part of the Life Wild Wolf project, where we're really trying to look at this issue of bold wolves in the environment and trying to see which factors could be influencing wolves that become bold, trying to avoid attracting wolves to humans, because usually it's some kind of attractant from human that leads to problems. There can be sometimes wild livestock that need more protection, or there can be garbage, or there can be other various factors that attract wolves. So try to see which situations where this happens and how it can be prevented is important. And doing other genetics and genomic research just to better understand movements of wolves and population structure within Europe. We have a very interesting project with colleagues in Serbia and Romania, where we're looking at what we're seeing is a very distinct population in the Balkans, south of the Danube, and then in the Carpathian Mountains, north of the Danube in Romania. And we're curious whether this is the river that actually has been a barrier, or maybe not a full barrier, but a filter to wolf movements, because this is a big, strong river and it was dammed, which makes it easier to cross, but only a few decades ago. So a very long history has been that the areas where it's more wild, where there are more habitats for wolves, is also where there are very steep riverbanks and a fast-flowing river. And we know, of course, from the coast of BC that wolves can swim very well, but some conditions with steep banks and fast-flowing water can be tricky. So we're now trying to look into this with genetics and landscape information to try and understand this better and see if this has actually been quite a filter or barrier to wolf movements. And then I have a student working on jackals, trying to understand some of these movements that have been extremely interesting for me to learn this, because it's such a parallel of the coyote situation in North America. So the golden jackal is really now spreading from having a many century long history in Southern Europe. Now it's really spreading in Europe, and trying to learn more about this and the population structure and gene flow and what's causing this process is really, really nice. And then a student project brown bear population study with looking at gene flow and population structure as well. So a couple of different species. And so learning these influences of the landscape is extremely interesting, and then understanding this.
Looking forward to following the river barrier project. Sounds extremely interesting. And it's so applicable to so many different species, and how these barriers, especially when you talk about dams, and how like it makes me think about, cutting off salmon habitat, and there's so many, I mean, in BC, so many massive restoration projects happening and removing those kind of barriers or just creating more habitat for these animals. And that's really interesting. And looking at like conservation and wolf recovery more broadly in Europe, how do you feel about the future of wolves?
Overall, I think that they are doing well. I'm optimistic. They are really reconnecting populations. Now we are seeing, for example, this long isolated Italian population is reconnecting with the Dinaric population in the Western Balkans. So this is has been interesting to follow. We also found one of our wolves in the Slovenian Alps. His genotype was found in southern Germany, so he'd done quite a trip north too. So of course, we know wolves can cover these distances. We have earlier findings on this, but it's still interesting to document it and see how they move these long distances, and to really also share with the public that they are doing this by themselves. We don't need to help them. They are, or we don't, if we're not moving them, they can do this. They walk long distances, so they really can travel, and they can live with us if we can live with them. Of course, there are challenges, but discussing calmly and finding solutions for this, I think, will be important, and be very aware that some people may be impacted more than others, so that's a concern also in areas, especially if for a long time they haven't had any wolves, so they hadn't had to worry about them. It may take quite some efforts to reestablish that, and that's maybe where one can also learn from other areas that never lost their wolves and have maintained that knowledge. So yeah, overall, I think it's really, really interesting to see how they have been recolonizing much of northern and western areas, and they're coming back to very different areas than they were in when they last were there some hundreds of years ago. So that process with wolves and humans is not always easy, but we see that wolves can manage, and hopefully over time that ecological role that they play will also be appreciated and integrated into conservation and land planning.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of this information that you're gaining, and how you mentioned just really helping people understand that it's a natural process. Wolves are doing it by themselves versus, I think some people feel in reintroduction efforts that it's being kind of forced upon them. And so it kind of highlights that importance of the education aspect of things. And also hearing, like you said, people have different experiences, and just listening to people. And it's definitely not just an ecological issue. It's a human issue as well. So we've covered a lot of ground with a lot of information and many of your contributions to wolf science. I wonder if there is a specific contribution to wolf science that you're most proud of.
I guess I can say that I'm grateful if I have been able to contribute in some way to wolves being seen with more nuance, that yes, they can cause conflict, but they also really have an important ecological role and an ecological function. It can be harder to put a monetary value on this than to a problem. So if they eat a cow, we can calculate maybe more or less what that was worth. But if they play an important ecological role also, where, for example, ungulates might be affected by disease, or looking at this bigger picture, that value is harder to discern maybe. But if this has contributed in some small way to wolves being seen with a bit more nuance in terms of ecology, that would be a good thing. I sometimes have talked to some people who after a while hear, oh, okay, yeah, maybe there is some important over long term with wolves that they didn't think about. And then I think also it's really important that we who work on genetics, and also, if I can say, we who work on ecology, speak together. So we're just discussing this with Italian colleagues too, that we really need each other and each other's information. So if I started in ecology and came to genetics, I brought at least the value of having ecology with me into genetics, and that I really appreciate. And I know colleagues who have maybe come the other way, and if I have helped a little bit in a small way to bridge some of those fields where possible, and in looking into the ecotypes and relating the ecology into the genetics, then I would be glad if I have contributed in a small way to that too.
Yeah, the interconnectedness between disciplines and that collaboration is so important. What has working with wolves taught you about yourself?
Probably the importance of persistence. Wolves are long-distance travelers. A lot of scientific questions, a lot of topics we work on, it takes time and persistence to get an answer. And sometimes you work for a long time, but you still don't get an answer. So this staying power, I think, if anything, has been the main take-home message from working with wolves.
And for young women and girls who might be listening and are interested in pursuing a career in ecology or conservation genetics, if you could share any advice that you would have for them.
Yeah, I think for any girls or women or any young person who is interested in this work, it's important to know that it may not be always the most stable work field. This is, in terms of you may need to move a lot and relocate a lot to new areas. So that's something to consider and that I've discussed with several young people who are interested. But on the other hand, it's a field where you really learn about nature, about yourself. You get to work with a lot of people who really are very inspiring because of their love of nature and their great interest in doing something for nature and the environment. And there are a lot of very good and inspiring people to work with and to learn from, and people who have a wealth of knowledge. So yeah, seeking out those people that you can learn from and learning from a variety of perspective, whether that is anyone from lab people and computer people to a lot of local people who have extremely good knowledge about the area where they work. So you really put together all those sources of information and build on that. So yes.
Yeah, blending the knowledge systems together can really create a powerful project and initiative. And
yeah, and you need all the people too. You are really your team effort is really composed of all these people who may be bioinformatician or local farmer or person who works in the lab or collects data. It's such a strength is really that team of people with all this different knowledge. Also very diverse people, and that's good for having as many ideas as possible, as many solutions as possible, and I think that's really, really key.
Well, Astrid, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It was fascinating to learn more about your work and your journey as a researcher, and thank you for all that you've done and continue to do for wolves.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for your time.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was hosted and recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
This series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger, a passionate field biologist, friend, and source of inspiration to many within Raincoast and beyond. Raincoast Radio is hosted by Chelsea Greer and produced by me, Sophia Osborne, with additional audio editing by Omar Salafu. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.